Vera Williams was 67 years old, a strong woman who had seen a lot in her life. She had served in the U.S. Army when she was young and earned respect for her courage and commitment. Now, in her later years, Vera lived peacefully in a small suburban neighborhood. She had grown used to the quiet streets, the familiarity of her neighbors, and the calm routine of her daily life. But recently, things felt different. There was a strange unease in the air that Vera couldn't ignore. It was a sunny afternoon when Vera left her home to go to the local grocery store. As she walked down the sidewalk, she could feel the warmth of the sun on her face. The familiar sights of the neighborhood, the trees, the houses, the little park she often passed felt comforting. But there was a feeling in the air, a shift she couldn't quite put into words. Some of the neighbors had begun acting a little differently. They weren't as friendly as they used to be, and there were whispers in the streets that made her uneasy. Still, Vera was determined to live her life the way she always had. She wasn't going to let the changing atmosphere get to her. The grocery store was just a short walk away, and Vera enjoyed the quiet moments. As she approached the entrance, she noticed a police car parked on the side of the street. It wasn't unusual to see police cars now and then, but this one seemed to stand out. The officer sitting behind the wheel was a man Vera had never seen before. He looked young, maybe in his late 20s or early 30s, with a stern face and a posture that suggested he was on edge. He glanced at her briefly as she walked past, but she didn't think much of it. She'd seen enough police officers over the years to know that most of them were just doing their job. After picking up a few items in the store, Vera made her way back home. She didn't expect anything out of the ordinary, just a simple walk back down the same street she had walked countless times before. As she passed the same police car, the officer, who had been sitting idly, suddenly got out of the car and approached her. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said in a voice that was colder than Vera had expected. "Can I ask you where you're going?" Vera stopped in her tracks and turned to face him. She hadn't done anything wrong, but she knew from experience that sometimes people, especially those in authority, didn't always need a reason to ask questions. Still, she wasn't afraid. "I'm just going home, officer," she replied calmly, trying to keep the situation as neutral. The days following Vera's visit to the police station were filled with a mix of anticipation and uncertainty. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was clear: she wasn't going to sit idly by and wait for change to come. She had taken the first step, and now, she was determined to see it through. Her phone rang often, with Marcus checking in on her, making sure she was okay. It was comforting to hear his voice, reminding her that she wasn't alone in this fight. His support meant the world to her. But she also had a growing sense of responsibility, not just to herself, but to the community. This wasn't just about one encounter with an officer, it was about sending a message. It was about showing that things needed to change, that people could stand up and make their voices heard. The neighborhood around Vera's home felt different now. There were still the usual faces of the people she had known for years, but there was also a new energy, an undercurrent of change. Some of her neighbors, the ones who had watched the confrontation unfold from their windows, started to approach her more often. They wanted to talk. They wanted to know what had happened, and they wanted to know how they could help. One afternoon, as Vera was tending to her garden, a woman she hadn't seen in years walked over. It was Mrs. Lancaster, who lived 2 houses down. She was in her late 60s, a retired schoolteacher who had lived in the neighborhood for decades. They had always exchanged pleasantries when they passed on the sidewalk, but they had never really spoken at length. "Vera," Mrs. Lancaster said softly, standing just outside the gate. "I wanted to apologize. I saw what happened with that officer the other day. I didn't know what to do at the time, but I'm sorry I didn't step in and say something. I should have." Vera was surprised. Mrs. Lancaster was always polite, but Vera had never expected such a personal acknowledgement. She smiled warmly at the older woman, wiping her hands on her apron before walking over to the gate. "There's no need to apologize, Mrs. Lancaster," Vera said gently. "I didn't expect anyone to intervene. But I appreciate you coming over. I've been thinking about it a lot, you know," Mrs. Lancaster continued. "About how things are changing in this country, how people like you, people of color, women, the elderly, are often treated so unfairly. I've heard about things like this, but I never thought it would happen here, to someone I know. I'm ashamed it took this long for me to wake up. I see now that we all have a responsibility to stand up when we see something wrong." Vera nodded, feeling a lump form in her throat. "I don't blame anyone for not stepping in. We all have our own battles to fight. But sometimes, it takes a moment like this to remind us that the fight isn't over. We can't just sit back and hope things change. We have to make them change." Mrs. Lancaster nodded in agreement. "You're absolutely right. I may be old, but I'm not too old to stand up and speak out. I want to help, Vera. If there's anything I can do to support you, please let me know." Vera felt a surge of gratitude. She hadn't expected this kind of support from anyone, let alone a neighbor who had kept to herself for so many years. But this was what Vera had hoped for when she stood up to the officer: the spark of change, the realization that people could come together and fight for what was right. Over the next few days, more of her neighbors reached out to her. Some offered moral support, others offered to help in more practical ways. It became clear that Vera's act of standing up to injustice had resonated with more people than she had imagined. What started as a confrontation with a single officer had sparked something larger, something that had the potential to ripple out and affect more lives. One evening, Marcus called to tell her that the police department had reached out to him. The officer involved in the incident, Officer Daniels, had been placed under review. There was going to be an internal investigation, and the department had promised to keep Vera updated on the progress. It wasn't a guarantee that anything would come of it, but it was a step in the right direction. Vera felt a small sense of relief wash over her. "We're making progress, Mom," Marcus said. "They're taking this seriously. And they're going to hold him accountable." Vera smiled, though she didn't feel entirely at ease. She knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be people who tried to sweep it all under the rug, people who would question her motives, people who would try to discredit her. But she wasn't afraid anymore. She had taken the first step, and she would keep going, no matter how long it took. A few weeks later, Vera stood outside her house again, looking out at the neighborhood that had become more than just a place to live. It had become a place where change was possible. It had become a place where people didn't turn away from injustice but instead faced it head on. As she walked down the sidewalk, Vera noticed something different. The world seemed a little brighter, a little more hopeful. She wasn't sure if it was because of the support she had received from her neighbors or the fact that the police department was finally taking her complaint seriously. Maybe it was just the knowledge that, even in the face of adversity, people were willing to stand up and make a difference. Vera wasn't done fighting. She knew that. But for the first time in a long while, she felt like change was within reach. She had been a soldier once, and now, she was still fighting for what was right. This battle wasn't over, but she was no longer afraid of the fight. As Vera stood there, watching the sun set over the neighborhood, she felt a deep sense of pride. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had reminded others that they too had a voice, a power that they could use to change the world around them. It wasn't just about one officer, one incident. It was about something much bigger: the power of unity, the strength of standing together in the face of injustice. Vera turned and walked back into her home, ready to face whatever came next. She wasn't backing down, not now, not ever. She was ready to keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel less than. This was just the beginning. and she would not rest until the change she had fought for was fully realized. As possible. I live just a few houses down. Vera stood her ground, her heart pounding in her chest. She had seen this kind of pee the next day. Vera woke up early, as she always did. She wasn't one to lie in bed for long, even after the stressful events of the previous day. Instead, she made herself a cup of coffee, sat by the window, and thought about what had happened. The sun had just started to rise, and the quiet neighborhood outside her window was still asleep. Vera, however, had been wide awake for hours, her mind racing. She thought about the officer's actions and the way he had treated her. She didn't know why he had targeted her, but it wasn't just about him. It was about the countless others who had been made to feel small, invisible, or unimportant. She couldn't ignore the reality of what had happened. It wasn't just a random encounter, it was a reminder of the prejudice that still existed in society. She had seen it in the army, and now, she was seeing it on her own doorstep. Vera wasn't going to let that slide. She had been quiet for too long, just going about her life, accepting things as they were. But now, something had shifted inside her. She wasn't going to stand by and let someone use their position of power to make others feel less than. She had been through too much in her life to let this be the moment that broke her. She was going to stand tall, for herself and for everyone else who had been treated unfairly. As she finished her coffee, the phone rang. It was Marcus. "Mom, I'm on my way over," he said. "We're going to do this the right way. I'm going to help you file that report. No one should be allowed to treat you like that." Vera smiled. Marcus had always been her protector, even when he was a boy. She could hear the concern in his voice, and it made her feel both proud and grateful. Her son had grown into a strong man, someone who would fight for what was right. "I appreciate it, Marcus," Vera said, her voice steady. "But I don't want this to be about causing trouble. I just don't want to feel like I can be pushed around anymore." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "I know, Mom. But you're not just doing this for yourself. You're doing it for everyone who's been treated like this, whether they're too afraid or too tired to speak up. We can't let this kind of thing happen without consequences." Vera nodded, even though he couldn't see her. He was right. It wasn't just about her. It was about everyone who had ever been made to feel less than because of the color of their skin, their age, or their gender. It was about changing the way things were, even if it meant standing up to the system that had been built to hold people down. As Marcus promised, he arrived at her house within the hour. He wasn't alone. He brought along his friend, Tanya, a lawyer who had offered to help them through the process. Vera felt a wave of relief when she saw the two of them standing at her door, ready to support her. "Hey, Mom," Marcus said, pulling her into a warm hug. "We're going to take care of this. You don't have to worry about a thing." Vera smiled and hugged him back. She was grateful for him, for his unwavering support, and for the fact that he had never made her feel like she was alone. Tanya followed behind, giving Vera a warm handshake. "It's good to meet you, Mrs. Williams. Marcus has told me so much about you. We're going to get this sorted, I promise." Vera nodded, feeling a little more at ease with Tanya there. Tanya was a skilled lawyer, and Vera knew that having her on their side would make all the difference. She felt a sense of hope she hadn't realized she'd lost. They sat down at the kitchen table, and Tanya began to explain the process of filing a complaint. "We're going to make sure that this officer is held accountable for his actions. The first step is to make sure we have all the details. I'll need you to tell me exactly what happened, from the moment you first encountered him until the moment you walked away. We'll make sure this gets reported to the right people." Vera took a deep breath, remembering the details of the encounter. She told them everything: the officer's initial question, his rude tone, the way he blocked her path, and his refusal to listen when she told him who she was. She described how he had tried to intimidate her and how, despite everything, she had stood her ground. Tanya took notes as Vera spoke, her focus unwavering. "You did the right thing, Mrs. Williams. Standing up for yourself is the first step in making sure something like this doesn't happen again." Vera nodded. "I wasn't going to let him make me feel like I didn't belong here. I've lived in this neighborhood for years. I've worked hard for everything I have. I'm not going to let anyone take that away from me." Tanya smiled. "And that's exactly why we're going to fight this. You're not just standing up for yourself, you're standing up for everyone else who's been treated like this." After they finished discussing the details, Tanya assured Vera that they would take care of the paperwork. She would make sure the right people knew what had happened, and she would follow up to make sure the officer faced the consequences of his actions. Vera felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She wasn't alone in this fight anymore. Later that day, Marcus and Vera went to the local police station together to file the official complaint. As they walked through the doors, Vera's heart raced. She had never imagined she would find herself in this position, but now that she was here, she knew it was the right thing to do. They were directed to a small office where an officer took their statements. Vera recounted the events, her voice steady and clear. She didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. She knew this was the right thing to do. The officer who took their report was polite, but Vera could sense that he wasn't entirely comfortable with the situation. He asked a few follow-up questions, and then assured her that the complaint would be investigated. He promised to keep her updated on the progress of the case. When they left the station, Vera felt a sense of relief. It wasn't over yet, but she had done what needed to be done. She had taken a stand, not just for herself, but for the future. She had refused to let fear control her life. That night, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, Vera felt a deep sense of pride. She had faced down injustice and had done so with grace and strength. She wasn't going to let the officer's actions define her. Instead, she had chosen to use her voice to make sure others wouldn't have to go through what she had experienced. Vera knew that change wasn't going to happen overnight. She knew that there were still battles to fight, still systems to challenge. But she also knew that every step forward, no matter how small, was a victory. And in that moment, she felt like she had won. Vera didn't look back as she walked away, but she could feel the officer's eyes on her. His gaze burned into the back of her head, and she knew that this wasn't over. He had stepped back, for now, but that didn't mean he was done with her. The anger that she had seen in his eyes wasn't something that would fade easily. She could tell he had underestimated her, and now that he had seen her stand up for herself, his pride had been wounded. And that, Vera knew, was the most dangerous kind of anger. As Vera approached her house, her body felt tense. Her muscles were sore from the encounter, but her mind was sharp. She couldn't help but replay the scene over and over in her head, trying to understand what had just happened. Why had he stopped her in the first place? What was it about her being a black woman walking in her own neighborhood that had made him feel so entitled to question her? The questions swirled in her mind, but she pushed them aside for now. She had to focus on getting inside, taking a breath, and moving forward. When she reached her front door, Vera paused for a moment. She had been through a lot in her life, and yet, this moment, this confrontation with the officer, felt different. She could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on her. This wasn't just about one officer. This was about the system, the deep-rooted prejudices that shaped people's actions and attitudes, the way society had taught some to see her and others like her as less than. She stepped inside her home and closed the door behind her, leaning against it for a moment. Her heart was still racing, but the rush of adrenaline was beginning to fade. Her legs were tired from the walk, but she knew she couldn't just sit and forget what had happened. She had to do something about it. Vera took a deep breath and walked to her kitchen. She made herself a cup of tea, her favorite calming drink, and sat down at the table. She closed her eyes for a moment, letting the warmth of the cup seep into her hands. Her mind was still racing, but she focused on the simple act of breathing, letting the tension leave her body slowly. She had learned long ago that it was important to take a moment to collect herself, to center herself before she made any decisions. But even as she sat there, trying to find some peace, Vera couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that this was only the beginning. The officer hadn't let her go because he realized he was wrong, he had let her go because he was embarrassed. But Vera knew that embarrassment wouldn't stop him from trying to make her feel small again. She had no doubt that he would be back, or that he would find another way to put her in her place. As the minutes ticked by, Vera made up her mind. She wasn't going to let this go. She wasn't going to let him or anyone else think they could intimidate her because of her age, her race, or her gender. She had been quiet for too long, just going along with life, accepting things the way they were. But this was different. This moment, this officer's attempt to make her feel inferior, had cracked open something in her. It wasn't just about standing up for herself anymore, it was about standing up for everyone who had been made to feel less than. Vera reached for her phone, her fingers hesitating for only a moment before she dialed the number she knew by heart. She wasn't going to keep this to herself. She wasn't going to let the officer's actions go unnoticed. She called her son, Marcus, who lived across town. He had always been her protector, and now, she needed him to help her stand tall. "Hey, Mom, how's everything going?" Marcus answered, his voice warm and familiar. Vera took a deep breath, the emotions of the day still swirling inside her. "Marcus, I need to talk to you about something that happened today." It's about a police officer." Marcus's voice immediately shifted to concern. "What happened, Mom?" Vera explained everything, the officer's questioning, the way he had tried to intimidate her, and how she had stood up for herself. As she spoke, she could hear the disbelief in Marcus's voice, and it made her feel even more sure of her decision to call him. She wasn't going to let this slide. She wasn't going to let him or anyone make her feel like she was in the wrong. "Mom, that's ridiculous. You should have never had to deal with that." "I'm coming over," Marcus said, his voice firm. "We need to file a report, and I'll make sure that officer knows he can't treat you like that." Vera shook her head, though she knew Marcus couldn't see her. "I don't want to make it a big thing, Marcus. I don't want to feel like I'm being pushed around, you know? I've had enough of that in my life. I just want to make sure it doesn't happen again." "I know, Mom. But we have to make sure it doesn't happen to anyone else. It's not just about you, it's about everyone who's been treated like this." "I'll be there soon, okay?" Vera felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had raised Marcus to be strong, to stand up for what was right, and now, it was his turn to help her. She wasn't alone in this fight. She wasn't just some elderly woman who could be dismissed. She was a force to be reckoned with, and with her son by her side, she was ready to take on whatever came next. After they hung up, Vera sat for a moment longer, collecting her thoughts. She knew this wasn't going to be easy. She knew that the officer would try to cover his tracks, that there would be people who didn't believe her, who would say it was just an isolated incident. But Vera wasn't going to let those voices drown her out. She wasn't going to let anyone silence her. As the sun began to set, Vera felt a sense of calm settle over her. She wasn't going to let this one officer define her. She wasn't going to let his actions control her life. What had happened today was wrong, and she wasn't going to rest until it was made right. She looked out the window, the last rays of sunlight casting a soft glow over the neighborhood. Vera had always believed in the power of standing up for what was right, and she knew that today, she had done just that. This wasn't the end of her fight. It was just the beginning. Abuse before, but this time, it felt personal. The officer's presence was suffocating, like a weight pressing down on her, but she wasn't about to let him intimidate her. Her experience as a U.S. Army veteran had taught her to stay calm in the face of danger, to keep her wits about her. She had learned how to stand tall, even when the odds were stacked against her. This moment was no different. The officer's eyes remained fixed on her, his posture rigid and almost threatening. He didn't seem to understand the gravity of the situation. He thought he could intimidate her, a woman much older than him, a black woman at that. But Vera wasn't going to let him make her feel small. She had fought for her country once, and now, she was fighting for her right to exist peacefully in her own neighborhood. "I told you, I live here," Vera repeated, her voice calm but unwavering. "You don't have the right to stop me like this." The officer took a step closer, but Vera didn't flinch. He was trying to assert his authority, but she wasn't having it. She had dealt with racism before, but this felt different. It wasn't just about her race, it was about him trying to make her feel inferior, trying to assert control in a way that felt unjust. "Ma'am, I need to check your ID," the officer said, as if that was the final word. He pulled his phone out again, tapping on the screen with quick, frustrated movements. His eyes never left her, as if he was daring her to argue. Vera stared at him, trying to read his expression. He seemed determined to make her submit to his authority. But Vera wasn't going to give in. She wasn't afraid of him, not anymore. She had spent years in the army, facing battles that tested her every nerve, and she wasn't going to let a man in a police uniform intimidate her. "You don't need to check my ID," she said firmly. "I've told you who I am. I'm going home, and that's all you need to know." The officer's face twisted in frustration. He couldn't believe that a woman like Vera was standing up to him, refusing to comply. He had expected her to be meek, to just accept his authority without question. But that wasn't who Vera was. She wasn't going to let anyone push her around. The officer stepped back, his eyes flashing with irritation. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he muttered, his voice dripping with contempt. "I could arrest you for resisting, you know." Vera's stomach tightened, but she held her ground. She wasn't going to let him threaten her. She had dealt with real danger in her life, and this wasn't it. This was a man with a badge trying to use fear to control her, and she wasn't going to let it work. "I haven't done anything wrong," she said, her voice steady. "And I won't be intimidated by you." For a moment, there was silence between them. The officer looked at her, his jaw clenched. Vera could see the anger in his eyes, but she also saw something else: uncertainty. He wasn't sure how to handle her. She wasn't acting the way he expected. He had thought she would be afraid, that she would back down when he used his authority. But she wasn't afraid. Not anymore. Suddenly, the officer's demeanor shifted. His posture became more aggressive, and his voice dropped lower. "You think you can talk to me like that?" he spat. "I'm a police officer. I tell people what to do." Vera's heart beat faster, but she didn't step back. She had been in situations far worse than this. She had been trained to handle pressure, to stay calm under fire. This officer, this young man, had no idea who he was dealing with. "You don't scare me," Vera said, her voice calm but firm. "I've been through too much in my life to let someone like you scare me." The officer took another step forward, his eyes narrowing. He was angry now, and Vera could feel the tension in the air. This was the moment when things could go either way. She knew he could escalate the situation, but she also knew she wasn't going to back down. She wasn't going to let him bully her. Just as the officer reached out to grab her arm, something inside Vera snapped. The years of discrimination, the years of being underestimated, All came rushing to the surface. She wasn't going to let this officer, this man who thought he could control her, get away with it. In one swift motion, Vera pushed him back, using the strength she had gained from years of training in the army. She knew how to defend herself, how to protect herself from someone who was trying to harm her. She wasn't going to let him touch her again. The officer stumbled back, caught off guard by her sudden movement. For a split second, Vera could see the shock in his eyes. He hadn't expected her to fight back. He hadn't expected a woman her age, someone he had clearly written off as weak, to stand up to him. But Vera wasn't weak. She had been through too much in her life to let someone like him push her around. She had survived wars, seen things that would break most people, and she had come out stronger because of it. This officer wasn't going to be the one to break her. As she stood there, facing him, Vera realized something: she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for every person who had been mistreated, for every person who had been silenced by authority. She was fighting for justice, for the right to be treated with respect. The officer's face turned red with anger. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice shaking with rage. But Vera didn't flinch. She wasn't scared of him anymore. "I've had enough," Vera said, her voice firm. "You can either step aside and let me go home, or you can keep making a fool of yourself." The officer hesitated, his anger still boiling over, but Vera stood tall. She wasn't going to let him intimidate her anymore. She wasn't going to let anyone intimidate her. Not now, not ever. Finally, the officer stepped back, his face a mix of frustration and disbelief. He knew he couldn't win this fight. Vera had already shown him that. And with that, Vera walked away, her step steady and confident. She wasn't going to let this officer or anyone make her feel small again. As she made her way back to her home, Vera couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. She had stood up for herself, and in doing so, she had reminded herself that she was stronger than she had ever given herself credit for. The fight wasn't over. There would be more battles to fight, more injustices to face. But Vera knew one thing for sure: she was ready for whatever came her way. The officer looked her over with a cold gaze, then asked, "What were you doing out here?" Vera was taken aback by the question. "I was getting groceries," she said, holding up the bag in her hand. "I'm just heading home." The officer's expression didn't change. He took a step closer, and there was a certain hostility in his eyes that made Vera's stomach tighten. "You know, you don't look like you belong here," he said, almost as if he were talking to himself. Vera felt her heart skip a beat. "Excuse me," she asked, her voice steady but now tinged with confusion. "I said, you don't look like you belong here," he repeated. His tone was condescending, and Vera could hear the judgment in his voice. "You're out here walking around. You don't even seem to know where you are. What are you doing?" The question was absurd, but Vera could feel her anger rising. She had lived in this neighborhood for decades. She knew it like the back of her hand. "I've lived here for over 30 years, officer," she said, trying to keep her cool. "I've walked these streets every day. I belong here just as much as anyone else." The officer stepped closer again, blocking her path. His face was a mask of skepticism and authority. "You don't look like you belong here," he repeated, and Vera noticed the subtle way his hand rested on his baton. It wasn't a threatening gesture, but it was enough to make her feel uneasy. At that moment, Vera realized that the officer was not asking questions out of concern. He wasn't interested in the truth or in making sure she was safe. He was profiling her, judging her based on her age, her race, and her presence in a neighborhood he clearly thought was beyond her reach. She wasn't about to let him get away with it. "I don't know what you think you're seeing, officer," Vera said, her voice firm now. "But I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm going home." The officer stared at her for a moment, his eyes narrowing. Then, without another word, he stepped back, as if he was deciding whether or not to press further. For a second, it seemed like he might just walk away. But then, in a move that caught Vera completely off guard, he said, "You know what? I'll have to ask you to stay right here. I need to check your ID." Vera stood still, incredulous. "What? My ID?" She couldn't believe what she was hearing. "I've already told you who I am, and I'm telling you, I live here. You don't have the right to stop me like this." The officer ignored her protests. "I'm asking you to stay here while I check your information," he said, pulling out his phone and swiping through the screen. His back was to her now, but Vera noticed his posture was tense, his shoulders stiff. He was still sizing her up, still deciding if she was someone to be controlled or dismissed. Vera stood there, unwilling to back down. She knew her rights. She had seen the ugly side of power before. As a U.S. Army veteran, she had faced much worse than this during her service. She had seen the horrors of war and had stood tall in the face of danger. But now, back on her own soil, in her own community, she was being treated like a criminal because of her race. She wasn't going to let it stand. With a deep breath, she straightened her back and looked the officer square in the eyes. "I'm not going anywhere. You don't have the right to stop me." The officer paused, as if considering her words. Then, in a move that shocked Vera, he took a step forward, blocking her path once again. His eyes were cold, dismissive. "I think you need to learn your place," he said, his voice rising. At that moment, Vera knew she was in danger. This wasn't just a disagreement. This was an officer abusing his power, using his badge to intimidate and control. She had faced racism in her life, but this felt different, more aggressive, more personal. Her heart raced, but she stood her ground. She wasn't going to let this officer push her around. Not today. Not ever.